Hi, everyone. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. I'm president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. And I'm thrilled today to be in conversation with the eminent political theorist and leading American public intellectual, Michael Walzer of the Advanced Institute in Princeton, Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Some of you will recall that we were going to put on a conference a few weeks ago on Jewish values in American democracy in this partisan moment. Obviously, because of COVID-19, the coronavirus crisis, we had to postpone that conference. Nevertheless, many of the same questions around Jewish and democratic, this American moment, who the Jewish people are in a moment like this, are equally present, if not more so. And not only that, but we get the added advantage of being right in front of Passover, where questions of Jewish politics, radical politics, revolution are on our mind. And to engage with all of these questions, I'm thrilled to be together with Professor Walzer. So first of all, Professor Walzer, thank you for your flexibility over the last few weeks. Thank you for adapting to this technology. And I first just to check in on how you and your family are doing and weathering this crisis right now.
We are doing okay, I guess. Planning a Zoom Seder, which is something entirely new to me since I'm tech incompetent. I will rely on children and grandchildren to make the actual arrangements.
Yeah.
Something we never expected.
Okay, so I want to come back a little bit later to talk about Passover, what it's going to look like and feel like in this political moment. But let me first start us off with a light, big question, which is, how are our democracies doing right now? There's obviously a big news story in the Jewish community and internationally has been Israel's near constitutional crisis in the midst of this pandemic. Obviously, as Americans, we're watching with powerful partisan lenses the role of the president and how he is handling this crisis. There is news of controversy in Central Europe with the consolidation of right-wing regimes. So first, tell us, how do you think democracy is doing in this moment, and how you see the pandemic altering kind of the state of government?
Well, we felt the fragility of democracy, particularly in Europe, before the coronavirus hit us. We were watching the rise of authoritarian regimes in response to economic difficulties. But we are now in a crisis which is always a test of democracy, because on the one hand, we need very strong government. We need governments able to take measures, coercive measures that we would not tolerate in other times. We need governments able to do that, and we need at the same time to sustain some kind of limits. And that's very, very hard to do. If you remember back in World War II, Roosevelt was virtually a dictator, and the Supreme Court, at moments like the internment of Japanese Americans, was not able to impose constitutional limits. Not until after the war did they return to those issues. So we have to accept a degree of coercion that we are characteristically suspicious of, and we have to try to sustain limits. And I can't tell you how that balance should be worked out. It will be a constant struggle.
Michael, I went back recently and reread an essay that I keep going back to, which is Isaiah Berlin's Message to the 21st Century, the commencement address that he gave at the University of Toronto in, I think it was 1994 or 1995, in which he argued that The great myth and mistake of the middle of the 20th century was the instinct to believe that complex solutions have single problems. And that in and of itself breeds the totalitarianism of the middle of the 20th century. And he says in the essay, "You must believe me, it's not true." And the more that we get seduced by these simple problems, there's no amount of violence, there's simple solutions rather, there's no amount of violence that a political leader will restrain themselves from in pursuit of those singular missions. And that therefore we have to balance justice, just enough liberty with just enough justice, etc. And I'm trying to, and so Berlin, you almost hear him begging by the end of the 20th century, don't, hold on to the kind of late 20th century pluralist, perhaps bipartisan ethos, and desperate to try to prevent the slippage back to the rise of authoritarian regimes. But why do we keep slipping into the authoritarian regimes? Why does this keep emerging? It happens, as you said, before the pandemic. Why do we have this gravitational pull as our societies away from Berlin and yours and David Hartman's pluralism?
Well, first of all, citizenship in a democracy is work, right? We have to pay attention. We have to work with other people. We have to work with other people whom we don't agree with or don't like. And it's easy when things get a little rough. And they have gotten rough before the virus hit us. There were more Americans living at the edge, more vulnerable people, more families feeling that an illness, a layoff, would push them over the edge into poverty. And the government was not responding. Neoliberal economics did not make for an effective response to this new sense of radical danger, of vulnerability. And people stopped thinking about working with others and compromising and arguing with people you don't like without hitting them. They forget, it's easy to forget all that. And then the appeal of some maximal leader who promises to make things better quickly, and who points you toward enemies that you can focus on, that you don't have to work with, but you can just hate them. This is a constant temptation whenever people feel themselves to be in trouble. And even before the virus, there were a lot of people in trouble.
I've been thinking a lot lately. You wrote about this, I think in 2014 or 2015, about how citizenship is rooted in obligation. There is we tend to think of citizenship as, or I think at least maybe my generation and younger thinks of citizenship as terms of entitlements. But I think you remind us that citizenship is first and foremost about obligation. And I've been thinking a lot, I've been wondering, watching our politicians, even last week in the debate in the House about the extent to which the stimulus package or the bailout package was helping ordinary Americans. I'm wondering why it is that our politicians don't talk to us really ever about obligation. Is it because it's simply a political loss? In other words, you hear government talking about what they want to do for their various constituents, but maybe I'm just an old soul. I kind of find myself longing for the Kennedys, demanding that, for the Kennedys' 61 inaugural address of, we should be galvanizing among our people a more powerful culture of obligation. There's no way to build citizenship without that language of obligation.
As you were talking, I was thinking of that line from Kennedy's speech. But it was a little too rhetorical. It was too perfect a statement, and it didn't have much follow-up in the years that Kennedy had to to change or try to change American political culture in a direction of ask what you can do for your country. It takes a war, it takes a crisis to push some people to think about those obligations to others. We've seen already a response here during the virus crisis. And what is most striking to me about the people who have come forward, the people who are taking risks on our behalf, many of them are the people we pay poorly and honor less in ordinary times. And they step forward now in ways sometimes heroic. Nurses, orderlies, attendants in hospitals. These are the heroes of this crisis. And we really don't know how in more ordinary times to honor them.
I mean, there's no more Orwellian term in our common culture than to characterize people as essential and non-essential. But you start to notice when we actually define who are essential workers, they are, by the same logic, the people who are not treated as essential financially or with the respect that they deserve during regular times. Yeah, I was also, when we think about these obligations, it strikes me that the only big obligation that our politicians have been asking of us is to stay home. And while on one hand, that's from an epidemiological standpoint, that's a very meaningful thing to do, to reduce the network of people you come into contact with and therefore stop the spread, flatten the curve, et cetera. It feels to me like the lowest level of our moral obligations to others is do no harm, right? It's not actually act on behalf of others, extend ourselves. And I don't know, it seems politically implausible that you would see a president especially this president, and during an election year say, what we really need to do is raise taxes on the wealthy. What we really need to do is to create cultures of certain types of austerity so that everybody can survive. But I don't really see a way to rebuild democratic culture without a real investment in a language and then in a culture of obligation. Yes.
Shlomo Avineri, the Israeli political theorist, posted a piece, I think, in Haaretz, saying that this coronavirus crisis marked the end of neoliberalism, and the necessary beginning of a politics of citizenship and mutual aid and of social democracy, some version of communal commitments to one another. By the way, we're not all being asked to stay at home. There are all those essential people, even to people who restock the supermarkets, who have to leave home and who have to accept risks that we are being told we can avoid by sitting in front of our screens or on our couches by ourselves.
So let's talk about that agenda of rebuilding obligation and citizenship and social democracy. Let me make an observation. You can tell me whether you think it's coherent. So if you Google the phrase Jewish and democratic, almost all of the results you're going to find relate to Israel. We can talk about Israel a little bit later. But there's very little that is seen as essential to the American Jewish project, even though you could argue, I think legitimately, that American experience the American Jewish experience of America is as profound a wedding of Jewish and democratic as the state of Israel has been, and for a lot longer. and with arguably better results in terms of not only the democracy of the country, but the self-definition, the identity of American Jews as committed to these values. But it seems to me that the Jewish community is not just not coalescing around a serious investment in democracy, but playing as equal a role as our neighbors in the partisanization of American democracy, the polarization between different Americans. So inside the Jewish community, you see the same dynamics of partisanship that are true among other Americans. So I'm curious whether you buy the theory that America is a Jewish and democratic state for Jews. And if so, what has to happen on the theoretical, but also really on the practical level to mobilize American Jewish support, not just for our own candidates or our own causes, but for the frameworks and structures of American democracy itself?
You know, it is certainly true that this is the best of all the host nations in Jewish history. And we have done well here, and we have become Americans. It was an ambition of the immigrants of my grandparents' generation to become Americans, and it happened. And so it's not surprising that in many ways we're not different from other Americans. But still, there are ways in which we are different. And one way is our politics, although we are, as you say, divided. We are overwhelmingly on the liberal side of the political spectrum, and that has been a continuous feature of Jewish post-emancipation politics. But we also have created a really remarkable Jewish civil society inside American civil society. I find Jewish organizational life both inspiring and exhausting. We are activists. The rate of participation. I remember the phrase participatory democracy from the 1960s. But Jewish communal life has been remarkably participatory, not necessarily democratic. We are still, as in all the diaspora years, our organizations are still dominated by a combination of the rich, the learned, and the energetic. Those three groups. And it works. And there are enough people outside of those three groups who also participate in lesser ways, and the rates are high. And the discipline is extraordinary. The solidarity. Can I tell you a story?
Yeah, please.
From Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. After my bar mitzvah, my parents took me to the annual UJA dinner, which was the big fundraising event of the Jewish year. And everybody came. This was 1948, an emotional year. There was a speaker from New York who talked about refugees, the war in Israel. And then pledge cards were passed out. And you filled out the pledge card at the table and put it in an envelope and passed it to the head of the table. where Sam Rappaport sat, who owned the biggest furniture store in town and knew everybody's business, who was doing well and who wasn't, who had a kid in school, who had a sick relative, everything. He would open the envelope and look at the pledge. And if he thought it wasn't enough, he would tear the card in half and pass it down the table. And that's the way Jews raised money without having coercive power, supposedly. And the community tolerated that kind of fundraising because everybody knew what the stakes were. Now, I suspect it would be hard to raise money that way now in most Jewish communities. But still, there is a level of commitment, of solidarity, which extends beyond the three, the rich, the learned, and the energetic who run the organizations. It extends beyond them. And the commitment is extraordinary. And it is, I know the divisions. Here in Princeton, the local synagogue had to bring in some some people who specialize in conflict resolution to deal with the differences. But still, the sense of solidarity is I think very strong.
I think the place where it strikes me that it breaks down a little bit in the Jewish community is when individuals or communities start to believe that they can win without the solidarity of the community, right? It's one thing to say we actually need the community. We need to be one American Jewish community, and we need solidarity in order to achieve our basic needs. And then you start moving up the Maslow's pyramid of starting with physiological needs all the way through self-actualization until you get to a place where people say, actually, I can achieve everything that I need to, but not only do I not need the community, but the community begins to drag me down. And what I've started to watch, I think, is the big generational shift, is partly because your story is rooted in remembering the founding of the State of Israel. For most of younger generations, it's not. There's not as much people are less convinced that they need the communal solidarity because maybe you could say cynically because they don't remember a time without it, or maybe because they can actually achieve what they need to achieve without having to feel morally compromised by remaining in solidarity with people who they feel are not essential to them. Right? Do you see this? Do you see this playing out?
Yes, maybe to some degree. I don't see it among my own grandchildren and their friends, but I understand that all of the polls show a declining commitment to Jewish peoplehood among younger American Jews, and a declining commitment. I'm not sure how sharp the decline in commitment to the safety, the well-being of the State of Israel.
What continues to make you a lot of the way you talk about solidarity of obligation, about citizenship, is rooted to, it seems to me, in a kind of deep optimism about the possibility of what the State of Israel can achieve, the possibility of what America can represent. We've obviously seen big setbacks in terms of the advancement of a democratic agenda in Israel and democratic values. We've seen big setbacks in the last number of years about this American story. Besides the answer of what's the alternative is worse, what sustains a kind of optimistic approach for the basically liberal Zionism that you hold fast to, and to the belief in the capacity of the American Jewish community to be in service of American democracy?
Well, first of all, you can't give up. And the whole history, my sense of the history of left politics is that it's a history of more defeats than victories. It's a history of continual re-engagement, steady work, as in the old joke about the man who watched for the Messiah outside of the shtetl. Pay wasn't very good, but it was steady work. That's the left. That's always been for me my sense of left politics. I don't believe that the arc of justice bends, the arc of history bends toward justice. My sense is that it's a zigzag, constant zigzag. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And in bad times, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And you keep marching. And that's Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, says that the Grand March is classic leftist kitsch. But it has its origins in our march from Egypt to the Promised Land. That's the original march. Mm-hmm. And from it, all of the metaphors of left politics, a newspaper called The Forward, or an Italian hymn called Avanti Populo, or the idea of a vanguard. All of the imagery of the left comes from that march, and it's a march through the wilderness. And there are murmurings and setbacks, and that's for me. That's always been the way it is. It was. It's always been and will be. It's. I never felt, even in the 60s, I never felt the euphoria of some new leftists. For me, it was always, this is a struggle, and we'll make a little forward move here, and maybe have to accept a step back there. And but there is, this is the argument of my book, Exodus and Revolution. There is a better place than Egypt. Mm-hmm. That we have to believe that there's a better place than Egypt.
It's interesting, Michael. This the principled anti-Zionist critique against the position that you're articulating. Let's put it in the mouth of, let's say, George Steiner, who wrote. Whose argument was actually very, very similar to the argument that you're making, that the Jewish people, as he writes, whose homeland is the text, are, as he says, nomads of the word, right? We are meant to be essentially a diasporic people, constantly marching towards the promised land. But the great departure that you've made is the argument that effectively the wilderness can be Israel. The wilderness can be the promised land, right? Because the anti-Zionist would say, I agree with you. We're marching through the wilderness towards the promised land, and that the belief that you've arrived in the promised land is its own form of deception, right? And that you're supposed to kind of idealize the journey on the wilderness. How do you square that? I mean, what does it mean for the Jewish people to have arrived in such powerful and profound ways as Americans, and to have arrived in the promised land, literally and figuratively, in the land of Israel in the 20th century, and to still operate with this paradigm of politics, which says that we're still marching through the wilderness?
Yes. Well, there are successes along the way, and the creation of the State of Israel was a success, but we all know that it isn't the end of the story. It isn't the Messianic kingdom. It is simply a better place than Europe before it was. And so each arrival is simply, I don't like the notion of stations, but each arrival is a place to continue to struggle. And look, I visited Israel in 1957 for the first time a 9-year-old country, a very small country, a radically egalitarian country. I thought it was socialism come to be, a very poor country. And Israel today is radically less egalitarian than it was then, and also less poor, in fact, quite prosperous. And so here was a victory. The end of the radical insecurity of statelessness, the radical vulnerability of statelessness was over. And yet the early promise of a socialist paradise was also an illusion. And the struggle for greater equality, greater justice, simply better health care, all of that continues. It doesn't, it never stops.
And therefore you would argue that the struggle to articulate its best democratic sensibility is basically today's equivalent of pursuing economic coherence, economic success. You know, where I think, I have learned from, and as a result, I share your politics. I've taught in similar themes at Hartman summer programs, including the famous story of Choni, the circle drawer, and which the Talmudic text teaches that if your job is to merely create the conditions for those in generations to come to see the fruits of your labor. But that in some ways, if you do see the fruits of your labor in your lifetime, it means you haven't dreamt big enough, which is a in the wilderness type of approach towards politics. Where I feel more, and I identify with that framework of liberal Zionism, which you've constructed. Where I struggle with it a little bit more is actually here in America, because, in Exodus and Revolution, I think you point out how many ways the African-American experience draws on the same ideas of the Exodus as part of its founding mythology as well. And there's an earlier time in American history where Blacks and Jews are similarly in pursuit of that kind of vision of justice. But there are many African-Americans today and many allies to African-Americans who would say that was a myth. This system was built on such deep inequality and injustice. If you read the 1619 Project from the New York Times, the argument is that the whole economic and political structure of the country is predicated on the slave trade. And at a certain point, those politics get really fatigued with the wilderness metaphor because they feel like what that's doing is keeping us down instead of actually trying to address something that is structurally broken. Or to use your language, you get frustrated with Exodus politics what you really need is some sort of messianic politics, a major social transformation, because something is deeply broken. What is the threshold at which point those messianic politics just become morally necessary because of the brokenness of what you're experiencing?
The brokenness is real. And well, first of all, it wasn't messianic politics in the 60s when Black kids were sitting in at lunch counters and young Jews like me went south to meet them and talk to them and support them.
No, I get that. I get in the 60s that it's a moment of alignment between Jews and Blacks around an Exodus agenda. But 50 years on, the condition of Jews has changed in America. The conditions for African Americans has not. And it suggests that maybe Exodus politics has run its course for at least one of these communities.
It was a tentative, precarious alliance even then. I mean, we went down there and told them we were slaves in Egypt. And they told us that's nothing like what's going on in Mississippi. And the tensions were there from the beginning, and they were justified. Their situation, what didn't really resonate with our Pesach memories, our Seder memories. It was there were good reasons for us to go down there, and there were also good reasons for them to say, you're not getting it quite right. But even so, the situation of African Americans today is better than it was in the 1950s. And there are political opportunities to make things still better. And I don't see any alternative to pursuing those opportunities, and you have to do them you have to do them honestly, so that when I see, say, Black Americans organizing Black Lives Matter, and I want to say absolutely, and the record of police brutality in Black communities is something we have to recognize and acknowledge, but it can't be that only Black lives matter. Hispanic lives matter. Native American lives matter. All minority lives matter, and majority lives matter. And the only way to change the behavior of police in America is through coalition politics. And so, and we have to talk about that. And I think the opportunities for success right now, the opportunities to change police behavior because of Black Lives Matter, but not by Black Lives Matter alone. That opportunity is something we have to seize, and that's the way politics works. An opportunity comes, and you have to seize it, and you have to talk about how to seize it, and you have to talk honestly to each other about the kinds of alignments and coalitions and negotiations and compromises that make the success possible.
You have an opportunity here with hundreds of rabbis and lay leaders and other professionals to help shape what is going to be a complicated Passover for a lot of us. More, as you said at the beginning, more lonely, more isolated than Passover usually is for many American Jews. And to do a little bit of what you laid out as kind of the template of Jewish memory in Exodus and Revolution, which is to be able to map the questions, the lessons of the Exodus to whatever Egypt the Jewish people have been in throughout our history. So maybe as a last word, tell us, give us a kavanah, a direction for how we might think of this Passover and how to take your ideas of recognizing that wherever we are is in the wilderness, whatever we're challenging requires of us to hold hands and march together. How do you want us to be thinking about that this Passover?
This may also be an opportunity to take seriously that moment in the Seder when we recite the plagues and dip a finger in the wine, to remember in a certainly inadequate way the suffering of the Egyptians, and here in our own plague year, it may be a more meaningful gesture than it has ever been before to remember the plagues of the others. So that is one thing I would think about on Zoom with my family this year. But I would also want to look ahead and ask, okay, this wilderness is going to be for some months, we hope not longer. What kind of promises do we want to make to each other about what comes after?
Michael, it's a joy and an honor to talk to you. I wish you and your family continued safety and health and happiness, and may we emerge victorious from this Passover in our continued march through the wilderness. Thank you very much.